My name is Ross Wiener. I am the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Education and Society Program, and I'm delighted to be with this amazing group of individuals to both celebrate SEL Day and to roll up our sleeves and do some learning. We're going to talk today in particular about some work in New York City that is really at the vanguard of filling out a holistic agenda around redefining student success, around their social emotional skills as well as their academic skills, getting them ready to thrive as leaders and members of their community. We're going to be, again, learning about this particular work under the umbrella of A City at Hope, which is really looking to marshal all of the youth supporting resources in New York City, those in school and those out of school, because young people are developing their social emotional skills all the time. And so we need to have strategies that respond to that. As we dive into this work, I just want to encourage folks out there in the virtual world to use the chat expansively. And to start with that, again, SEL Day, just want to ask folks to use that chat function and share what's one way you're reimagining community for SEL Day, or what's a way that you're building bonds with others using your social emotional skills on SEL Day. So please use the chat if you can. So just before, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists in just a minute. But again, just to frame our conversation today, we're talking about A City at Hope. And A City at Hope takes its name actually from the final report of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development that I was honored to serve on and work on at the Aspen Institute, and that David Adams was a practitioner leader on as well. And A City at Hope is then taking that, the recommendations and the framing of A Nation at Hope, and really looking at how do those recommendations actually get enacted in the context of the real work of schools, of youth development organizations, of a whole city as the learning environment. So we have an amazing panel to learn about that today. And as I introduce folks, I will just ask you again to exercise your social emotional learning skills and to come on and share just one word that captures how you're feeling at this moment. And so I will start with David Adams, the CEO of Urban Assembly.
Hey Ross, happy SEL Day to you. I'm very excited to be here. And I gotta say, I am feeling excited and motivated to see so many people engaged in the kinds of work that support the social and emotional development of students across the country and the world. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to this conversation.
Terrific. Thanks, David. And Elizabeth Stranzl, New York City Director of Education Policy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Ross. I'm so happy to be here. I think my word is excited. I'm really excited about the energy of the day. We're seeing a lot of great stuff on social media, participating here. Just really a privilege to be in community with you and to be surrounded by so many people championing the work. So very excited. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Susan Haskell, the Deputy Commissioner, New York City Department of Youth and Community Development.
Hey, Ross. Thanks. It's good to be with everybody here today. I would say hopeful. I'm feeling a turn, and there is a lot of opportunity, so I'm feeling hopeful today.
Terrific. Thank you, Susan. And Jacques Noisette, Director of Social Emotional Learning, Expand Ed Schools.
Thanks, appreciate it, Ross. Just feeling really optimistic. I'm going to go with Susan on that. Just feeling really hopeful and optimistic about things turning around for the good. I'm really excited to be on this panel and to share and learn from you all. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacques. And Ebony Ford, an educator at the Urban Assembly Unison School.
Good afternoon, Ross. Thanks for having me on this panel. This afternoon, I'm feeling excited, I'm feeling hopeful, and I'm really feeling encouraged about the work that's going on, particularly here in New York City around social emotional learning.
Excellent. And Ebony, we're going to come back to you in just a second. So I will say, right, we're hearing optimistic, excited, hopeful. I will add motivated. And so just really appreciating all of the tremendous work that you all on this panel represent, and that all of you out in the field are investing in really building up our young people to take their place as leaders for today and tomorrow. So again, our conversation today is going to key off of social emotional learning, SEL, And so let's start by, again, going right back to Ebony and right into the classroom. Ebony, you've got the closest proximity every day to students of anybody on this panel. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about, why does SEL matter to you as a teacher, as an educator? And then if you can, what have you learned about just supporting students' social emotional needs over this last year that has just brought so many challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, so I'll say, I think the first thing is that we know that SEL is necessary, absolutely necessary for our young people to navigate the world around them. We know that they are going to inherit this world soon, in the next few years. And so it's important that we are helping to equip them with the skills, attitudes, and values. Sorry, I'm in my classroom. Sorry about that, school bell. But it's necessary for us to help them develop the skills, attitudes, and values that are going to be necessary for them to be not only successful adults, but to be thriving adults. So, middle school in particular is the perfect opportunity for us to help students to begin to develop those skills. Students need to know how to collaborate with one another. They need to know how to navigate through conflict. They need to know how to advocate for themselves and for their community. Most importantly, or not most importantly, but also they need to know how to keep going and keep trying even when things are unsuccessful. And so, I'm really excited and dedicated to making sure that this is happening for our students. And to answer your second part of the question, we know that SEL, many people use SEL as a behavioral management tool, and it's not a behavioral management tool. SEL is important for us, for our students, because we are helping them to develop and grow into their best selves. And so we know that it's more necessary now than ever. You mentioned that this has been such a hard year. It definitely has. So one of the things that we've learned at school, at my school here, is that our students need to really feel a sense of belonging and a sense of community. They have to know that they're not alone in this thing. And so we know that they have to be able to form and foster relationships with one another, with their teachers, with even their family that they're stuck at home with over the last year. So we know that relationships are like the foundation to academic as well as social success for students. And so when we prioritize SEL on a school-wide level, the outcomes are amazing. We'll see positive academic outcomes, positive attendance outcomes, positive social outcomes as well.
Thank you, Ebony. And so I want to open it up to some of the panels, and Elizabeth, I'll turn to you first, right? So going from the classroom all the way to a system that is responsible for over 1 million students, how do you think about the importance of SEL for the work that you do?
Thank you for that. And first, I just want to thank Ebony for her contribution. If that was a tweet, I would be hitting the like and retweet button the whole time, because I really resonated with that. Just hearing her say SEL is necessary for the world, SEL is the work of community, that there's an urgency that we have as adults really resonated. Like, yeah, we know SEL is really powerful, so let's step up and provide that. And just thinking about the power of SEL is part of what's energizing, like Ebony said, when you think about it at the systems level. For me personally, my background was as a psychologist, so SEL was my entry point to education in the first place. And what I knew to be true about SEL when I started my career is what's still true today, which is that SEL is the heartbeat of schools. SEL humanizes school, it personalizes school, it warms school, it makes school community. And SEL, I think, really helps us see students as people first and learners second. And as a division, I'm thrilled to be here representing Deputy Chancellor Robinson in the Division of School Climate and Wellness and the work of so many people across our huge system. We've always known that SEL is the work to do. SEL is having its moment right now, and we're very hopeful that we realize that it needs to be a movement and not a moment, because the work of SEL was important before COVID, and it's going to be important long after COVID. And the work of educators and leaders is really to help people understand that, like, there is power in SEL anytime that you invest in it at the student level and at the systems level. Exactly like Ebony said, it allows us to support young people to thrive to their best self. So that is the spirit with which we are approaching the SEL work. That is the spirit that's going to sustain us as we continue to do the work, and hopefully continue to do that in community with people like those on the call, those listening, and all throughout our system for for many years to come.
Terrific. Thank you. And David, I'm going to turn to you to kind of round out the kind of in the school community perspectives on this and, you know, just sort of riffing off Elizabeth's framing of SEL. It's always been important, but it's kind of having this moment, right? You've come from being the SEL director to the director of strategy to now the CEO. And so we'll love to hear about how, as the CEO, you're thinking about what is the role of SEL in the work of Urban Assembly.
Well, it's a great question, Josh. Excuse me, Ross. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I think when we are looking at what learning is, right, we know that all learning is social and emotional. The science of learning and development folks have said that. You said that in terms of the Aspen Commission. All learning is social and emotional. So the goal here is to channel the social and emotional dimensions of learning so that our students can access the best outcomes that they can. So what we're looking at the Urban Assembly is really thinking about how do we take the social and emotional dimensions of learning and ensure that they are infused in schools' instructional approaches and their behavioral supports, in their social emotional supports, in their extracurricular activities, so that our students are college, career, and community ready, right? SEL is having its moment because it's clear to us that community matters, relationships matter. And it shouldn't have taken a whole COVID pandemic for us to focus in on these dimensions of our young people. It shouldn't have taken an insurrection on Congress for us to recognize that we need to solve conflicts with our words rather than with violence. And so really excited to be able to think about what the whole child looks like, really excited to think about civic development in the context of perspective taking, relationship skills, and communication skills. And Ross, we're really excited to be part of the City at Hope and think about how we activate all of the levers of New York City to ensure that our young people bring their best selves to solve the kind of problems that we need to make sure that they inherit the city in the way that they deserve. So I'm really excited to be here, Ross, and thank to our fellow panelists for being here as well.
Also, thank you, David, so much to pick up on as we go through this conversation. But on that last point, right, thinking citywide. So let's bring Susan and Jacques into this. And Susan, I'll turn to you next, right? So from the Department of Youth and Community Development, how does SEL show up in your work?
Thanks, Ross. At DYCD, we contract out for out-of-school time programs, community centers, after-school programs, services for runaway and homeless youth, and job programs. And I think what I'm taking from what my colleagues have said here, especially Ebony with that word necessary, you can tell that resonated with the panelists here, is it's taking me back to the work that we were doing when we started these discussions before the pandemic in response to City of Hope. And I felt like there was real fundamental alignment in the way the different partners, you know, the education system, what Elizabeth said, what David said, and the out of school time programs around the way we feel so passionate about SEL and prioritizing it. And I think, Ross, something you said when we kicked off got my attention about how, unlike other skills that we want our young people to develop, as they're learning social emotional skills all the time, one way or another. They're either developing them or they're, you know, losing ground. Like we can't, unlike, you know, math and biology, either, you know, you may be learning, but you're probably not slipping, you know, unless you're really reading the wrong stuff. But with social emotional learning, we have to understand that young people are absorbing these kind of skills at all times. And so we have to be intentional about developing that. It's necessary. And the other thing Ebony said was about relationships. Relationships are the evidence-based practice. It's everything. Elizabeth mentioned that too. So that's where our head is at in the out-of-school time area at DYCD.
Terrific. And I know we'll come back to that and just thinking about how this sort of broader ecosystem all gets sort of, again, marshaled and purposed for supporting young people's development. But Jacques, I want to invite you into the conversation now as well. Right, tell us about, you know, how SEL is important in your work.
Sure, thanks for that, Ross. Definitely SEL Day is important, but the overall theme and the perspective of the well-being, the emotional well-being, and the mental health of our students matter. And our approach this year with expanded schools has been more of a SEL, not just being what we say, what we do, but it's in our DNA. It's within everything that we are part of or attached to. It's from the STEM teacher to the ELA teacher, from the gym instructor to that mentorship volunteer. Everyone has an opportunity to not only build SEL skills, but also to model it. So we've been focusing on that as well to help and support many of our staff members to build their own SEL skills in order to support our students. And I think that once we start firing from all cylinders, from that school day, after school, volunteers, family engagement, as we present a more supportive community, it provides more of an opportunity, a robust opportunity for our students to really grow and develop with their social and emotional skills. So I'm really excited about that. And just seeing this approach to being more of a macro level and supporting city communities and involving the community in this process.
Terrific. Well, I know we'll come back to that, just those big ideas as well. But David, I'm going to turn to you because, again, we are today keying off of the City at Hope initiative. So first, just want you to tell us even just a little bit of the backstory about how you went from this National Commission report into this body of work that a City of Hope represents.
Well, thanks for the question, Ross. So our goal with the City at Hope is really to take these recommendations from A Nation at Hope, which was led by the Aspen Institute, and brought together folks from across the country and identified some key concepts that we needed to do in order to pursue high quality social and emotional outcomes, right? The Aspen Commission talked about social and emotional and academic development. It talked about making sure all of the systems in an organization, in a state, and city are organized around similar principles of social and emotional development. It talked about research and practice coming together in order to support the social and emotional outcomes. And the most important thing that I did is the Aspen Commission's Nation at Hope reminding us that all learning is social and emotional. And so, you know me, I wasn't happy to have a report. We had to do something. We had to take this and translate this into the place where I do my work, which is New York City. So I had an opportunity to work with Expand Ed. Expand Ed got some partners together, and we wanted to make this live. And in fact, you may not appreciate this, Ross, but we challenged ourselves to do this quickly. We challenged ourselves to really take this Nation at Hope and New York City-fy it. Right, so we had the City Council, we had the Children's Commission, we had out-of-school time folks, we had the Department of Youth and DYCD and Department of Education, we had criminal justice folks all come together and say, what do we need to do? In fact, our current chancellor, who is Chancellor Misha Ross Porter, was on that working group as well. Right, so we started and we said, let's come together, and the first thing we needed to do was come to a consensus on what we meant by social and emotional learning. And if I could just throw out some key pieces that we learned, first is that we moved from a student to a New York City youth, right? What is the experience in a New York City youth? What does a New York City youth day look like? And it turned out that they didn't sit here and say, I am going to school now. Now I'm participating in out-of-school activities. Now I'm participating in city agencies. No, they experience this as one holistic sense of their day. And so we need to think about how we organize our systems and supports to do that. The second thing we figured out was that adults matter in terms of how our students' social and emotional development outcomes go, right? And so we need to really concentrate on what kind of adults we want to have around our kids if we want social and emotional skills to be the outcome of the work. So we got together, we had some couple of great working groups. We had folks like Elizabeth and Ebony and Susan and Jacques really orient us towards how we can move from a nation at hope to a city at hope. And in between that, we had a racial reckoning, we had COVID, and all these things just became that much more important. And so what you'll see now is an interim report that allows us to start to think about this is what we've learned so far. And by the end of this year in June, we're going to have our final report that's going to recommend how we're going to move from a nation at hope to a city at hope in 2021.
That is terrific. Thank you, David. And anything, so really appreciate those lessons and the shift on the content. As we then move to open up the conversation, anything that you want to share just about what it took to do this work across the different governmental agencies, non-governmental partners, philanthropy partners, like just what did you learn in trying to create that space? And I'll just say, I'm asking because I'm hoping actually that this can become a model for how other communities come together around these issues. So would love for you to just put any of those lessons learned on the table.
Yeah, I won't take too long on this, but in 3 words, Ross, it took social emotional skills, All right. So we got to collaborate. We got to make sure that we're taking in different viewpoints. We got to navigate those viewpoints from different stakeholders. We got to know what our stakeholders care about and make sure that we can be responsive to that. So if we can't bring people together around a common sense of purpose, we're not going to really have a great social and emotional learning commission. So if I could just put out the importance of SEL skills in that context, I hope my fellow panelists felt like we were responsive to their needs and lived out our values.
Excellent. Thank you, David. So, Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you next. Again, pulling back up to the New York City Department of Ed, and at this really auspicious moment where new chancellor, Misha Ross-Porter, has just taken, her leadership post in the system, coming sort of through the ranks, actually coming through the urban assembly as a principal, and then as a regional superintendent. So again, and sort of somebody who has lived this work of prioritizing SEL. So would love for you to speak to how are these issues sort of being embraced and advanced from the New York City Department of Ed. And we'll love if you can. I mean, I think, it's such a big system, thinking about the commitments and about what are the roles of school principals in this? How do we think about, back to Susan's point about students are learning this all the time. They're seeing what's modeled for them. They're experiencing whether they're in healthy spaces for social emotional development or not. So how do you think about just creating that healthy space that models positive social emotional learning, again, from your system perspective?
Thank you for that question. I can't speak officially for Chancellor Porter, but I can say that she is a true champion of the work, and in her time thus far has communicated a commitment to SEL on multiple occasions. As for the Division of School Climate and Wellness, SEL has always been and always will be a core part of our agenda across all of our offices. We are continuing to advance the implementation of restorative practices and universal SEL programming. We are very excited to be reopening access to athletics because we know that participation in sports has tremendous social emotional benefits for young people. We are continuing our work with health education, which has a comprehensive SEL curricula, with expanding access to mental health support in communities hardest hit by the pandemic, and really deepening our foundational SEL work through SEL academic integration, which we've talked a little bit about. So for us, it's absolutely still part of the agenda. That's work that we anticipate doing in partnership with and under the leadership of Chancellor Porter. As for healthy and safe spaces, we think about safety as being complete safety, so psychological, emotional, and physical. And the first thing that comes to mind is something we've already talked about today, which is relationships, relationships, relationships. The principal, as the leader of the school, has the ability to shepherd certain things and guide the way for adults, but this is really the entire school as a community that has tremendous power to leverage relationships to facilitate emotional safety. Emotional safety means young people are welcomed, affirmed, and celebrated as their unique selves. It means honoring their identity and lived experiences as they tell them. It means we're holding space for them to process what is happening in the world. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Masheri Keels at the University of Chicago, and she shared something that really stuck with me that I think resonates here, which is that when adults in schools do not acknowledge and hold space for the reality that young people are experiencing outside of school, it creates a dissonance for young people, and that dissonance becomes distressing. So in other words, to be a healthy and emotionally safe space, schools have to create opportunities and have that conversation so that young people can bring in everything that they're experiencing outside, because otherwise they start to question the validity of what they're going through and their emotions. Like, wait, I just experienced this big thing. All this stuff is going on in the world, and at school, nobody is talking about that. Nobody is asking me, how am I doing? No one is opening the space for me to share, and that feels really confusing. So the pandemic has brought unprecedented levels of stress and trauma, like David said, alongside recent attention on very long-standing racial injustice. And young people need to be free to express that. For them to feel healthy and safe at school is when they can bring their complete authentic selves into the school building and know that they are going to be listened to, honored, and supported. And so I think principals have an opportunity to message that, to support their staff to be able to do that, and really to think about what are the structures that we can build in our school to create that space. how are we organizing structurally through advisory, morning meeting, restorative circles, check in, check out? What are you structurally organizing to create the space for that? And there are a variety of ways to do that. Our principals are doing this in really innovative and progressive ways. And just yesterday, a principal during a professional learning session talked about how their school safety agents are partnering with them to have these conversations and to do their trauma responsive work. So that's another way that principals can lead, is they can bring people into the space and they can normalize that this type of conversation and this type of support is how we do school. And it's what it means to be a community here. And so we see a lot of leaders stepping up to the plate and leading in that way, embracing that responsibility and opportunity. And we look forward to continue working with and supporting principals, to continue doing that moving forward.
So really inspiring, just the sort of just holding that whole, that recognizing that space that students have had to persist through so much in this last year. And just curious, I mean, Ebony or Jacques, I just want to invite either of you, if you want to mention, just like even down at a really granular level, like how are you finding you're having to adapt to respond to what your students need right now, young people, not just students in terms of classrooms, but young people as their whole selves.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Just, going off of what Elizabeth was saying, Elizabeth was talking about the importance of having these spaces where students can communicate what's going on. So at our school in particular, we use an advisory model. And it's, done every single day. Students have an opportunity to build community with, a small group of students, 10 to 12 students, and one person, which is their advisor. And so just giving students that space where they know that they have the opportunity to talk about really what's happening with themselves, within their community, come to agreements together, it's super important for our students. And another thing that Elizabeth said was they can know that they can be their complete selves. And so, yeah, at our school, advisory is that space where students have that ability. And so the importance of having a school administrator that really supports social emotional learning is super important. So I'm glad to hear, and I'm also glad to be a part of the New York City Department of Education, where a lot of principals are actually taking this seriously for students.
Just want to echo that as well, Ross. Just piggybacking on that theme of a loving space, expanding schools, we've been doing our best to define that with our partners. And what does that mean to be where a student feels like they're welcomed, where they're affirmed, have a sense of belonging, and creating opportunities for students to actually express how they've been feeling. We've been doing PDs on how to have difficult conversations with students around race relations, around disparities that are happening out there, and putting them in the forefront and having them speak on it and offering their suggestions and ideas on those concepts, but also making sure students feel welcome in that environment. And that's something that we've been endeavoring to improve with our partners and providing those spaces and PD opportunities for them to learn and how to create that. I, for one, see this work very personally. I know when I was a middle schooler, I wasn't as cool as I am today, My kids would definitely echo that sentiment, but it was definitely, it was a tough time and dealing with biological, physiological changes, and also the stressors of just being a preteen or being a young student and feeling all of this type of societal pressure to be who you are. And at the same time, this wave of pandemic hits and it just throws everything up in the air and we don't know how to handle it. But our students are looking for the adults to kind of lead these kind of conversations where they can express how they're feeling, express what's happening with them, with their families, and we're there to support them in that, to navigate through these tough terrain waters, and also giving them strategies and tips on how to best come out on top when it comes to these kinds of circumstances.
So Jacques, now I'm going to turn to you and Susan to really fill out the kind of broader ecosystem approach, but I just want to name that focus on adult professional development and just also on just supporting adults in their own wellness and building their own social and emotional skills. to cope with, again, what everybody's had to work through over this last year just feels so essential and important to name. So just want to thank you for putting that on the table as well. And just as I turn to a couple of questions for Susan and Jacques, just want to invite everybody who's with us today online to use the Q&A function to add questions. We have an amazing set of expert resources on this panel today. And so I've got lots of questions that I'm happy to keep asking, but we're going to reserve some time for your questions as well. So please do use that Q&A function. But I am going to, since I still do have the moderator position right now, I'm going to keep asking a couple more questions. And I just want to acknowledge, right, the report, both the Nation at Hope report and the interim report from A City at Hope are really emphatic about the need to to take an ecosystem approach, that social emotional development is happening all the time, and that we have a responsibility as adults and leaders to think about the kind of coherence and the continuum of support that students and young people experience, so that they're not having to actually make these abrupt shifts between contexts, but actually it all feels like part of, again, that same continuum of support. So I want to ask you both, and Susan, I'll start with you, talking about what does it mean to transcend the sort of in-school versus out-of-school work? Both, why is that important? But also, like, what did you realize over the course of this project about what are the opportunities and what are the challenges we have to address?
Thanks, Ross. One of the things I took away from that experience is how far we've come, as I mentioned, in terms of alignment and really coming from the same mindset and language in different arenas where kids are. One of the ways I like to think about, this circle that has social emotional learning, all the things that young people need in it, is that, and Jacques, I'm curious what you think about this, is that teachers and schools have social emotional learning, as my colleagues have described, as like this fundamental frame for teaching cognitive skills and helping young people progress along their academic learning, and they have to go hand in hand to achieve that goal. And I think for youth development and out of school time activities that are happening, we use the context of like skill building, whether it's creative arts or athletics, recreation, STEM, literacy. We use the content as a tool to build the social emotional skills. In other words, our focus is the social emotional skills, and we'll use those items. And it doesn't matter so much in the youth development world what it is you're learning. It's more that you found something that you're passionate about, you're interested in, you have the opportunity to be successful at it at your level, not a standard level that's been set for all sixth graders. And I think that's the value we bring. We have the same goals in our circles. The shift, which should be really seamless for young people, is just, keep the focus, I would say. And I've seen very encouraged, the youth development field, back in the day, it was enough to have like a caring adult who came from your community in an after school program, let's say, who gave you the social emotional supports that you needed. And we didn't pay as much attention, I'm talking about like decades ago, to how do we take advantage of this? How do we help kids learn the things that they need and boost their academic in that? And then I think schools also, to some degree, I'm generalizing here, were very academic focused, but struggled a little more with understanding the importance of the social emotional skills that the out of school time brought to that. And I've seen, we get closer and closer and closer towards alignment on those things. So I really did feel encouraged by our common language and goals. And that's the way I see the different parts of a young person's day.
Yeah, that was great, Susan. Thanks for mentioning that. I totally agree. In terms of when it comes down to it, one of our core elements is school and CBO collaboration with expanded schools. And we understand that when that partnership is strong, then implementation is strong, and we have stronger students in building skills. So we were endeavoring to help partnerships grow stronger through this pandemic year. And it was quite tough. I have to admit, the challenge when this hit, everyone kind of went to their own corner to try to figure out how to work, how to navigate, how to pivot effectively, and trying to restore these kind of relationships and making them feel stronger, and also aligning messages and practices and somewhat philosophies and visions to make this effective. That was tough, but we found it to be necessary in order for us to make a major impact with our students. I, for one, endeavor to always check in with our partners. And I think that's one of the key things, is to, sometimes we talk a lot, but we don't really listen that well. I think if we take the time to say, hey, what is going on? How can we support you? How can we help you? That was the first strategy that we implemented with our partners. And we had a directors convening. We met with all of them individually as well. We had random and periodic check-ins with them, but also just making sure we hear from them and that their voice mattered to us, and how we could effectively support them with the relevant PDs, which was shifting. It was, remote engagement, how to deal with trauma, how to deal with grief. These are all topics that we had to learn on the fly and to help support them and provide them with the right resources. Last year, when this first hit in March, we were just dumbfounded, like, what are we going to do? How do we handle this? How do we support them? But throughout the year, this is why I'm optimistic as well. I'm very hopeful. We gathered together and we worked together. And I think that having a mantra, or having a concept or idea that we work stronger together, we're better together, and really adopting that mentality when it comes to school and CBO partnerships, I think we could provide such an enhanced and robust program for our kids. And when we did that, we actually looked at the schedule, looked at how we could best support their staff. To be quite honest with you, I had staff, I was talking to directors about deliverables, and then one of them told me that their intern passed away from COVID the week before. And having these kind of conversations was tough. And on the fly, saying we need support on grief and trauma with our staff. How do we get around this? How do we navigate through this process? This is very difficult. And as an agency, we worked together, we partnered, and we listened, and we were able to galvanize a group, a team, to provide resources that were effective and relevant for the time.
So in a second, I want to bring back in now the sort of folks who sit in the education system and talk about what it's like to try to work in an ecosystem approach across, both from a policy and then a practice perspective. But I just want to say, Jacques, thank you for bringing that very just real human experience to the table in this conversation. I just think we can't lose sight of how much support and just rebuilding of relationships, and that starts with listening and being responsive. So just want to appreciate your living that example and bringing it into this conversation. Elizabeth, so we've just heard about this need for like an ecosystem approach, and even this acknowledgement that schools really, for a couple of decades have been asked to focus really pretty narrowly on academic achievement as kind of the definition of success. And so curious, as you listen to Susan and Jacques talk about what the out of school and after school community can bring into this conversation around youth development, just how do you think of that from a policy, from a policy perch, but within the education system?
That's a great question. I think that one thing that became even more clear during the pandemic, but that we knew before, is the value of out of school time and community partners in doing the work with us, because of the way that they have been able to leverage SEL for success outside of school. There's lessons that we can learn there. There's a lot of content expertise that organizations like that bring to the table. And they, kind of like Susan was alluding to, they've been able to focus on like the fun and creative SEL stuff without having to worry about some of the limitations that are sometimes in schools. And so I think the challenge then is how do you bring those learnings and that knowledge and that partnership into a structure like the school? And so I think part of that is helping all educators understand how social emotional learning is not like something fun or fluffy that you just sprinkle on top of school to make it feel a little more humane. It is really the core of how we learn and how we operate as human beings. And so in crisis comes opportunity, and COVID has created an opportunity where we can leverage this humanity and vulnerability that people are experiencing and use that to break the door open to say, hey, this is actually really important. other partners have been doing this work for years. Let's learn from what they've been doing. Let's learn from what research says. This isn't just like feel-good work. There's really substantial research about the academic benefits, for example, of investing in social and emotional learning. So to shift it into schools in a way that changes policy and practice requires anchoring in research, bringing partners to the table, personalizing it for people so that they see how it connects to their work, and then thinking about how do you embed it in what you know to be important. So when we talk, for example, when the chancellor talks about reopening of summer school or of school next year, even bringing high schools back, it's now just become normed as part of the conversation of like, yeah, that needs to be part of what we're doing. We're not just coming back to learn. So it is complex in a system of this size, but when you're willing to, bring stakeholders to the table, help them see how their work connects to this, and then leverage them as partners to do the work together, I think you can see some success in making some of those shifts at the systems level.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Ebony, want to bring you back in. So, right, how does this taking an ecosystem approach, recognizing that students actually are, right, learning and developing as they come to school, through school, as they go to after school, and that, how do we make all that coherent? And what does that mean for you as a classroom educator?
Yeah, as a classroom educator, it's just important for me to remember that they're not just students, and we're not only focusing on academics. These are actual people that are going to grow up and be global citizens. And so the things that we teach our students around social emotional learning is going to help them not only in their time in school with us, but also when they decide to go to college and or career, when they decide to go out and inherit the world. And so someone in the chat said, make the connection with academics. And so when I think about social emotional learning and academics, I think about how, as a teacher, I have a student that might be struggling. And as an advisor, I'm going to teach that student the skills that they need to advocate for themselves when they are struggling. Also, I'm going to teach the students how to review their work and how to set goals and how to check in on their goals. And so as an advisor and as a teacher, I am helping my students to support themselves. So again, it's not like they're not only just my students. These skills that I'm teaching them in the classroom, they're going to need to know when they get outside of the classroom and they're away from me. They're going to need to know how to goal set. They're going to need to know how to advocate. They're going to need to know how to build relationships with people across differences. So, I take this as an opportunity for us to practice now. And the earlier you practice, the better you get. And so, yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. And we may come back, as you acknowledged. I think, David, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll go to some of the questions folks have put in. And one is about how to not see it as a trade-off between social emotional development and academics, but as those things actually hang together. And so appreciate your beginning to answer that, and we'll invite others to see if we want to put more on the table there. But David, again, after this, I think we'll turn to some of the questions participants put on the table, but just want to get you to kind of close out our understanding of this, and talk through what role Urban Assembly played in sort of creating this sort of community, this collaborative that produced a City of Hope. What did you learn about how to approach a coherent agenda? What are the challenges, again, so that other folks can think about picking up this kind of model in their communities?
Thanks for that question, Ross. First, I want to really recognize the work that Ebony is doing. Our teachers are really struggling right now in our schools. It's a really difficult time in terms of all the things that are happening. And listening to you, Ebony, really gives me that sense of motivation, that sense of just honoring what you guys, the teachers, have been doing, as well as our principals. So I just want to shout you out, Ebony, and teachers for the work they're doing and remembering the whole child in this really difficult time as schools reopen. I think Ross, to your question, when we think about what the Urban Assembly is doing, our goal is to produce innovation within public education, right? So we partner with the New York City Department of Education to innovate concepts within district schools and then to disseminate those innovations to the larger space. And when you have an organization like the Urban Assembly sitting just adjacent to the larger space, right? So the DOE is this huge organization with hundreds of thousands of students and millions, really, thousands of employees. And then you have the urban assembly sitting just a little bit outside that, right? You have Expand Ed, who we partnered with, right? Who's got this really clear out of school time focus. And what we can do is we can kind of be like your cousin. You don't live with them every day, you know. You see them on the weekends, but when you go to your cousin's house, you look around and you're like, wow, this is a little different, right? You can kind of see from the outside looking in. And so that gives us the ability to kind of bring folks together beyond their specific agendas. So we brought together equity folks, we brought together folks who are focused on criminal justice and criminal justice reform. And it gives us a little bit of a way to listen a little bit more in depth to what people are saying. So when Susan says, you know, she really appreciates this alignment between what we're talking about in schools and what we're talking about out of school time, that alignment is listening. So I would say that the Urban Assembly was able to come through and really listen to what people cared about. And then go back and talk about, you know, how do we take what people care about and write it up in a way that resonates with their needs. So the things Ebony's talking about, relationship skills, listening, perspective taking, these are the things that we need to do. And I just want to give a shout out to Tacoma, Washington, because Ross, we had an opportunity to go out to Tacoma, and I was so inspired to see this entire city organizing around similar principles. And we're a little bit bigger than Tacoma, Washington, right? But we're New York. And if Tacoma, Washington can do it, we can do it too. And that's what we hope to bring to the bear and solve this problem.
Really appreciate that, David. And, you know, for folks who are interested in going deeper, the National Commission did produce a case study of that sort of whole child agenda in Tacoma, and how really, right, it did come together across Department of Education, Parks and Recreation, Family and Youth Services, the mayor's office, public libraries. So a great example there, and I appreciate you you sharing that. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that folks have put in the Q&A, and I'll start with one from Steve Alexander, who shared that as a mental health practitioner, I'm cognizant of how powerful SEL is for students. Then the question is, has there been any meta-analytic research that speaks to SEL potentially lowering incidents of school-based victimization, specifically bullying within underserved communities? And I think, David, you have some, at least, lessons that you can bring from the Urban Assembly Resilient Scholars Program, and then we'll invite others to mention anything that's relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So one of the great things I think about SEL is it's asset-based, right? So it's not about what we're reducing, it's about what we're increasing. And we know the research from the Urban Assembly Resilient Scholars Program has demonstrated that we're increasing supportive learning environment as per the school climate survey that the New York City Department of Education gives out to all their students. We're also increasing trust, right? And so supportive learning environments, trust, are the absence, not just the absence of bullying, but the presence of positive interactions, the presence of high quality relationships. So we know that the social and emotional skills that our students develop through these kinds of experiences, things like relationship skills, we watch students develop and be able to give compliments, receive compliments to each other. All these things matter. And we know that when we increase these things, when we promote social emotional competence, students are less likely to engage in bullying types of behaviors and things that lower the quality of the climate and culture in the school. So I would just say we care about what we do more, and what we do more is better climate, better social emotional competence and outcomes, and students who can solve problems in ways that are constructive.
And for the other panelists, as we go through some of these questions, if you want to be adding something, please just let me know so I can make sure to turn to you. And David, just appreciate how that answer, right? In some ways, it actually even goes back to that it's not a trade-off between academics and social emotional learning. It is what young people are being engaged in all the time. If that's modeling positive relationships with each other, showing actually how to have civil debates, bringing restorative practices into school, then that's what they're going to learn, and then we're going to reduce the kind of right, bullying and other negative behaviors. So appreciate that. Definitely invite anybody to come back in on that. Let me go to the next question, which is from Pamela Sivens, I think, says, how are you working with youth as they develop strong supportive relationships through SEL to build social capital and their networks and to use these assets?
One thing I can say is we're teaching students that these skills are transferable and that you can use them in multiple spaces. And so we're doing a lot of talking with students about, yes, you can use this skill here in the building with us, but can you also talk about how are you using these skills outside of school? We know that if you are responsible, you're able to show responsibility with, getting your classwork done. You are also showing responsibility at home by babysitting for your parents. You are also, showing responsibility by getting your chores done. So really helping students to realize that their skills are transferable into multiple places. And I think that really gets to the whole in-school, out-of-school thing that we were talking about earlier. It's not just an in-school thing, it's an outside of school thing as well. And so, yeah, I think that's one thing that I can add. Does anyone else have anything that they want to add?
Ebony, I think that's an excellent point, and I will just extend that, sorry, Ross, if I may, to workplace cultures. And I think we've been hearing from employers for ages about, 21st century skills and how important it is, like teamwork, communication, responsibility. I absolutely think that the work we do with young people in SEL in schools, in out of school time, builds social capital for them. And I think it's important, like I mentioned before, what is the content? It's important for us to find the strengths of young people in their interests and try to align them as much as possible. If you really love doing this in after school, here are some career pathways that connect to that kind of skill you're developing or your interest, and really help them to be able to turn those skills into really capital that they can keep building on for years to come.
And so I'll add, just maybe in a transition to this next question, right? There's been a lot of enthusiasm as we think about how to address the disrupted learning that students experienced over this last year, talking about the role of high dosage tutoring, and thinking about if there are going to be supportive adults working with students regularly 4 and 5 times a week. How do we make sure we're building in relationship skills and being intentional about how young people are building their social capital through those relationships, not just their foundational academic skills, which both are important, both go together, as we've talked about on this panel. So that just seems like an opportunity. And I'll use that to segue to the next question, which is from Kathleen O'Connor. And I will just say, I think it may be from a Kathleen O'Connor that I know who runs a tutoring center for Rohingya refugees in the city of Chicago, Fora, forging opportunities for refugees in America. And so, again, doing amazing work. And her question is, with regard to the importance of nurturing the relationships between adults and young people, do you have any advice about helping educators and parents feel confident discussing tough topics, racism, sexism, family conflict, past trauma? These topics are so salient to young people. And how do we empower adults to honor those concerns and to be helpful in young people's processing of them? And so who wants to take a first attempt at that?
I can get us started and then encourage anyone to jump in. I think this is a really important point, and I'm so glad that it came up because it comes up pretty much every time we talk about this with different stakeholder groups. There's really a lot of anxiety that we see on the part of educators to feel like, well, are you asking me to become a counselor? Are you asking me to become a social worker? I don't have the training for that. What if, I ask a question and then I get a response I'm not prepared for? And similarly, families have reservations. There may be different cultural norms around information sharing. There may be different comfort levels. Like, why are you talking about that at school? I don't want you to talk about that at school. I think on the educator end, what's really important is helping to establish some parameters for how we engage in these spaces. Earlier, I talked a little bit about structures and creating space for conversation. I think there's a structural component to that and also like a capacity building and support aspect to that. So creating norms for how we have difficult conversations, agreeing to, co-creating those norms as a class community, explaining things like limits of confidentiality, explaining the purpose of having these conversations, and helping to differentiate, like, there are going to be things that we can talk about as a class, and maybe there's some things that we need to talk about privately, and there's other professionals in our school who can help you with that, so that the adults are really clear that, like, yeah, we can normalize processing of shared experiences as part of learning, but that doesn't mean we have to go into deep clinical territory with young people that we're uncomfortable about, because some of these are just shared experiences. Like someone, I coughed on the bus and everyone stared at me like I was spreading COVID. Like that's a real thing, and a teacher could talk about that with their students without having to have a mental health background. So, creating some norms around the conversations, creating space for them, establishing the limits, and having your clear lines of support built up so that if something does cross into other territory, adults feel like, okay, I know how to get support for that child without having to engage in it myself. And then creating opportunities for adults to practice these things. So when the DOE was reopening schools in the fall, we created different resources for schools, one of which was a Bridge to School plan. And in addition to activities that were student facing, we had a lot of adult facing activities, opportunities for adults to practice difficult conversations, to practice circles, to practice asking questions, active listening, all of these same SEL skills that we're working on with young people. How are we building that in adults? And so I think school leaders and district leaders have a responsibility to adults right now, if we're asking them to step into this space, to create the resources for them to do that. And there are a lot of resources out there. And I think that there's definitely a path forward here, despite what can sometimes feel like anxiety for educators.
Hey, Ross, I just want to add to that as well. I agree with totally everything that Elizabeth was saying. Just setting those parameters and creating norms around these kind of conversations. We actually do PDs on having difficult conversations and facilitating that with educators and also with families, but also understanding that for students, we don't always have to feel the pressure of finding a solution. I think just giving them the space to talk about these things and having a listening ear is effective within itself. And talking about race relations, talking about sexism and family conflict, and just letting them talk, and of course, giving some guidance and giving some kind of parameters around that. But I think that it goes a long way when a student feels like, you want to hear from me, my voice matters, my opinion matters, and maybe I can find my own solution. We have to also trust in the intellectual capacity of our students, that they can also solve some of these problems on their own. And we just give them the proper guidance to do so. But we don't have to be a professional or an expert in that field in order to create those spaces for them to talk.
Ross, if I could just jump on this question briefly as well. Jacques said something that really resonated with me, and Elizabeth alluded to this, right? One of the hardest things that we teach clinicians and folks is how to listen, right? It sounds like a really simple thing when you asked me, like, how do you create a working group? And you said, well, you got to listen. That's not that hard when on its face, but in fact, like really listening to children, really listening to your peers, that is hard. And what I want adults to understand is that if you are listening to your students, to your youth, that is one of the most healing things that you can provide. There's no, gymnastics. There's no real complicated formula to this that makes them more effective or less effective in terms of social emotional competencies. If a student wants to talk about a experience with race, listen. Right. And that's the hardest thing. So I just wanted to really resonate with what Jacques and Elizabeth said, right? Adults can listen. And that is what students feel. If you are present and you are listening, you are providing healing for your young people around these difficult topics.
And just to add one last thing, our students are going to learn about these things and have these discussions outside of school. They're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're on Twitter, they watch the news. So they know what's going on. So why not give them the space to actually have the opportunity to talk about them?
If I can round it out, because I think that was such an important question that we got, and I know we're short on time, but I do think that we focused on adult development of social emotional skills. And I think although there was a lot of alignment with this group, we saw the need to keep going to really expand the breadth of understanding among the adults that have impact in young people's lives. And I think as we require and push adults to develop their own self-awareness skills, this is part of social emotional and social awareness skills. In particular, look, my demographic, I'll speak for my demographic, white people in America, we have to do a better job understanding our place in social awareness and how that connects with a young person's experience, and be a listener when it comes to these things. So I think it's really that, I think that is really part of one of the things we targeted as a top priority for this group is getting the social emotional skills across adults in New York City, in large part so we could be prepared for those kinds of conversations, because adults could relax and feel comfort in their skills, if not to solve any of this, just to be present in those conversations.
So that was just such a rich response. And I think that, you know, I just want to acknowledge, I think I'm going to close us out and recognize that this has been an extraordinary experience of listening. You all just are doing amazing work in supporting young people and leading us towards a city at hope and a nation at hope. There is so much work to do. I will just acknowledge we got a chat talking about, yes, how important this is. And there's a need for just more healers in our schools, more counselors, more psychologists, more social workers, just more support. And we meet today at really an incredible moment of also transition and hope for the country, where there's just been a massive investment in young people, in their families, but also in their schools. And so I just want to thank you all for the work you're doing, for the wisdom that you shared today. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. You know, we started off by sharing what were people feeling right now, and it was hopeful and optimistic and excited. And I just leave this conversation with more of those things. So again, thank you to the Urban Assembly. Thank you to all of you and to everybody who participated today. Happy SEL Day.
Thank you, Josh. Happy SEL Day.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.